Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Wolf, and you've reached Farming Fast and Slow. This feels the most like a radio broadcast than I have done in a very long time. And I am joined here today over the phone line with Cody Bishop, and we are going to talk about frost. Cody, what's your title again?
Yeah, Orchard Technology and Process Manager.
Okay, and you work up in Washington, if I recall, and remind me of that wonderful crop that you grow.
Yeah, I work for an apple, cherry, and pear grower. We grow a little over 2,000 acres of apples, cherries, and pears, and then also do some of the apple packing ourselves.
Nice. So Cody and I were exchanging ideas about the show, and we really thought, to talk about frost, there's part of it that's, there's a bunch of physics, and then there's part of it that there's a bunch of practicalities of farming. And so we drew straws, and I drew the short straw. So I'm going to be talking about the physics part, and Cody is going to be talking about the farming part. I have to be honest, I've not ever stayed up all night worried about whether frost was going to come. And so I just need to delegate to the experts on that. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll probably talk here between us for about a half an hour, and then about 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. I don't have an engineer this time, so I'm going to be going pretty loose with the time, but I'll try to keep it more or less on track. There is a Q&A button at the bottom, so if you want to ask your questions, then when it comes time for the Q&A part, we can go through all of that. And just a note, you probably see the little button that says that we're being recorded. I feel like Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison Blues every time I need to remind the audience that we're being recorded. So all the words that you can't say. I will post this on YouTube later, so this can be sort of entered into the permanent record. And of course, on all of the comment sections and questionnaire, whatever, love to hear what kind of topics you would want to hear about next. So this is the professor part of the talk. And so let's think about frost, and, my way into it, thinking about how to explain frost, what makes frost compelling. You could just say, well, it's when the temperature goes below zero. And that is a, valid answer. But there's parts of it that are a little bit more complicated, like why does it go below zero? And so my entry point is through understanding the planetary boundary layer. And so that already probably sounds a little bit crazy. Like, what is the planetary boundary layer? So on a regular summer day, if you look up and you see little puffy clouds up there, their bottom is basically defining the top of the boundary layer. And so this goes up, hundreds, if not thousands of feet up into the air. And it represents this area where, there's a lot of mixing. So you picture that, come sunrise, the sun hits the ground and the ground starts warming. Okay, the light obviously penetrates through the air. And at a certain point, the temperature of the ground is warmer than the air above it. And what do we know about hot air is that it rises. And so that hot air is kind of in training as it rises, causing mixing of that boundary layer. And so that boundary layer, I'm going to draw a little picture. the y-axis is going to be height, and then the x-axis is in time. And then, you know, this boundary layer is going to go up. And then what happens when the sun goes down? Suddenly, that driving force that's driving the growth of the boundary layer is gone, and everything starts cooling. Okay, so what used to define the energy budget of the grounds during the day was that short wave, primarily from the sun, and then suddenly the sun's gone. And what takes over is the long wave budget. And long wave radiation is, everything has long wave radiation. So, you know, our bodies radiate, the sun radiates, the sky radiates, clouds radiate, and we radiate. That radiation is known as long wave radiation. So I'm going to write that LW. And we radiate proportional to the temperature. And in fact, we take a little Greek symbol, sigma, called the Stefan Boltzmann constant, times this emissivity, times the temperature in Kelvin raised to the 4th power. And so what do we know about the ground is it's like basically, you know, our temperature, 25C. What do you know about deep space? It's like absolute zero. And so we're radiating out a lot more than we are taking in. And so our energy balance is negative, you know, it's going on a heat diet. So you might say, well, why don't we just like go to zero every night, you know, if we're radiating out into deep space? And that actually, that's what happens on the moon and places that don't have an atmosphere. As soon as the sun goes down, it gets really freaking cold. And then when the sun comes up, it gets really hot. But here on Earth, we have an atmosphere, and that atmosphere is full of gases. You know, chiefly among them is water vapor. And so water vapor emits radiation. And so the radiation that is emitted from the water has this emissivity, but in the absence of any air, that emissivity becomes really small. So the emissivity of just a gas is really low. So what happens is that, you know, there's some nights where there's clouds, and those clouds are actually, they might be cold, you know, they might even be approximately zero. But in terms of long wave radiation, they're still radiating a lot down to us on Earth. And more or less keeping kind of a nice, easy temperature at night. Now, let's say there's no clouds, and it's not just that there's no clouds, but there's just water vapor. But let's say there's practically no water vapor. That's when the land is radiating out into space, right, at sigma epsilon temperature to the 4th, and nothing is coming back in. And so under those conditions, the temperature just drops precipitously. And so that is kind of the conditions. Clear night, seems kind of cold. That's when we're worried about frost. So one of the other kind of aspects of frost is, you know, we've got this radiative component, and as it's cooling, the density of the air increases. And so you may remember back in high school, PV equals nRT. So as the temperature goes down, so too does the volume occupied by this space. And so as it's cooling, it gets denser. So this is why, you know, when we've got landscapes that have hills and valleys, the cold air flows downhill because it's denser into the valleys, and it pools there. This is one of my favorite words. It's known as katabatic wind. So that's winds that are driven by the cooling of the air. And this is why, particularly in, valley areas are why you tend to be most concerned about frosts. And then, we get into this question of like, well, okay, so it's getting cold, but why do some crops seem to be sensitive to the cold and other crops not so much? What is the cold, what does frost specifically actually do? And so there's a couple aspects of it. One is that, we can be concerned about fruits. Picture you get a bad batch of navel oranges and there's something that's like, oh, these aren't very good. They're kind of mealy. What happened there is that frost crystals actually grew in the cells of the fruit, and they punctured the cell membrane. And so the plant is still alive, but the fruit just doesn't have the, the bursting experience that we have. Another way that the frost impacts plants, it's also through the ice crystals, but the ice crystals allow for air bubbles to form in the vascular tissue of the plant. And so that frost can lead to what's called cavitation. We're used to thinking about cavitation happening, during, drought conditions. When the leaves are transpiring and the soil can't supply it, and the vascular system implodes, that also can be brought upon by those ice crystals forming. And so a lot of the solute mechanics of the plant are built around dissolving starches into sugars to lower the freezing point of the cells so that they can avoid frosts. So it leads to, if we understand some of the physics, what do people do about it? I was in Fresno last summer, and the story blew my mind. They used to actually burn tires when there was a frost event, which sounds nuts, and it was, so they outlawed it. But what did the burning tires do? Well, one thing is that they fires generate heat, and so it warms it up. But it's not like you're out camping and you have a campfire and all that heat goes off into space. It generates, remember that the air is so cool, it generates some smoke, and it's capped inside this boundary layer. And so the smoke, because it sort of forms this capped layer, prevents the radiation from going out into space. And so it sort of is a substitute cloud. Another way into this has been big old fans out there in the fields, and those, again, they're making use of that boundary layer structure that's happening where the ground is radiating off into space. It gets cold, it's colder than the air above it, so it's got this capping inversion. So there's warm air up above, but it happens to be really cold down where the plants are living. So the fans come on and they mix it up. And so they're entraining this warm air that's aloft down to where the plants can, avoid freezing. And then I've always loved sprinklers. One is that the water does have some heat, but it's not actually what prevents the frost. It actually takes so much energy, the latent heat of sublimation of turning something from a liquid to a solid, that it really just requires that much more energy from the environment than the environment can provide in order to create the frost. And so it sort of shifts the goalposts for the frost. So we're at 1:15. The physics lecture is over. And I wanted to bring in Cody. Cody, I brought you on because you really have held our feet to the fire as far as what constitutes a good frost control product, you know, not just something that measures the physics of all this stuff. But, you know, how do we make practical use of the data that come from those measurements? But I wonder if we could take a step back and you could tell us, you know, about a year in the life of apples and, you know, or cherries or pears, and really, you know, when does the worry come in?
Yeah, so the worry really comes in during when we start seeing those warmer temperatures start coming through, and we start seeing that the tree's starting to wake up, and we see the buds pushing. We see that green little tip coming out, and when we start seeing that, we're really monitoring those temperatures, and we're looking at what's the temperature going to be that night, what's the lowest it's going to be, because how tight that bud is, the tighter it is, it can withstand a lower temperature. But as that bud starts to open up, the temperature it can withstand, it starts raising. So you start getting into trouble areas. Really around 27 degrees is when that blossom's starting to open up. And when that blossom's opening up, that's when the pistil inside of that blossom really becomes in trouble. And so we're really looking, I mean, it can really depend on the season and the year, but basically anytime from February into April is our frost season. And it depends on really those warm temperature degree days and how many temperature degree days we're really getting that are above the 32 degrees that are waking that tree up.
When I just as an aside, do those blossoms, are they coming out the same day every year, or do they have some chilling requirement that is, you know, depends on the prior winter?
It's a bunch of factors. It really depends on the weather from the previous season. It also depends on the variety. So like Granny Smith and your Pink Ladies, those blossoms are gonna open up a lot quicker and faster than your Gala or your Red Delicious. And so it's very almost variety specific. So yeah, certain ones will turn on sooner than others.
Do you find yourself sailing close to the wind as a farmer in terms of wanting varieties that are, you know, marketable earlier, but, you know, you're playing the dice a little bit with the frost? Like, why not only plant late?
Yeah. So that's actually, like, Pink Lady is kind of an anomaly. Pink Lady will bloom first, but Pink Lady picks the latest into the end of the year. What I forgot to mention is we're worried about frost even when the apple is on the tree. So that's even back in end of October into November. We can't let that apple drop or freeze below 32 degrees. Certain varieties can handle that frozen apple better than others, but typically you get into like 2 frozen apples where that apple is thawing and defrosting. The integrity of that apple, kind of what you're talking about with those cells exploding and basically turning to mush. And they don't do well in storage after a season like that. So to go back to that question is, yes, we're looking for varieties that hit that sweet spot where we can hit that early market. And we're also looking at when is it blooming. We don't want a late bloom, because if it's a later bloom now, it means it's going to be a lot later, and we're back into that October, November time frame where we're worried about frosts hitting those apples. And so that's when we start looking into the topography and planting trees more on hills or more frost-free areas, and like you were saying, avoiding valleys. And when we've got a valley, we're putting those frost machines and a lot of sprinklers in that area.
Is that just unavoidable that, you know, you might wish as a landowner that you have only hill slopes, but the reality is you're going to have some valley?
Yeah, it all depends on the area, but the ideal situation is a higher elevation with flat land. I mean, an area that's frost free, so it's easier to work. But there are some areas that you can find, and you kind of have to study where those draws are and where that dense area is going to really collect, and because it kind of funnels down to that draw, and you have to be really careful that, because if a certain percentage of your acreage is going to be hitting to those draws, you're increasing your sense to, or you're exposing yourself to 20-30% damage, to really depending on the year.
Is that pretty, do you figure you're going to get some damage every year and you just want to avoid getting double digits, or how is this a danger that is chronic and you're just trying to minimize it, or is it episodic, like once in 10 years you get a frost and it's devastating?
Yeah, there's been other growers and farmers that have told me about, I believe it was in the early 80s, there was a big frost event in Washington that wiped out, I want to say it was something like 80 or 90% of the crop across the valley. It didn't matter what where those crops were, and it got so cold at one point that the trees actually started cracking, and that's when you're well below zero, and you can hear and so that'll wipe it out. But on a typical year, I mean, yeah, you're looking at, you're gonna get frost damage regardless. But what you remember is that each one of these trees that we've got in the ground, they're producing 300, 400 flowers a tree. I mean, really depending on the type of system you're growing, but we're going to come in later that year and do blossom thinning. For example, like on galas, we've got a set number of flowers that we want on that gala tree. So there's factors, and as much as I would love to say frost will thin the tree perfectly, it doesn't happen that way, and it's going to, of course, wipe out your flowers that are closer to the ground first before it wipes out the ones that are up above on the top of the tree.
The ones that are just in reach from the pickers.
Yep, exactly.
If only it thinned from the top down.
Yeah, that would be nice.
So there's a certain amount of frost that is economically neutral to you because you're going to thin out the blossoms anyway.
Yeah, just not uniformed how we would love it to be. So it is a concern, and we definitely, I mean, we've got guys that are doing 12 plus hour shifts throughout the night. Just they're making sure those machines are running, the sprinklers are running, and we even we'll put fires with apple wood or cherry wood or pear wood out in the roads, and we'll basically kind of create a wall of heat so that wind machine can grab that heat. And it's very hard to push heat, to push a wall of warm air. It's very hard to do that. So you have to kind of play around with where you're putting those fires, and you're looking at your topography and where those wind machines are placed.
So if we picture a draw, and at the bottom there's a pool of, you know, cold air, then will the fires be kind of upstream in the draw so that it's being caught by the fan?
Yes and no. The guys that I've been talking to and I've learned a lot of this from has said it is extremely hard to push that warm air. A lot of what that warm air is for is to make a wall of where the draw, because we'll know where the cold air is coming through. Like what you're saying is when that sun rises, it's bringing that cold air from the ground up. But we
Yeah.
also know where it's going to be where that cold air is coming from. So if you've got hills in the distance, you know there's going to be cold air coming from those down and going to be rushing towards the low spot. And so that firewall is kind of like a wall to help as a barrier. And then the wind machine is doing its 5-minute rotations where it's just trying to get that hot air up in the top and pushing it down. So
Fascinating. So it's like a room fan almost.
Yep. Yeah, almost.
This is, I mean, I wish we had like a topo map to look at. So what parts of it strike you as failure prone, or maybe even if you could draw out, technologically, what's on your, wish list, or what do you use now to deal with it, and how could it be better?
Yeah, so there's a lot of companies that have tried to give the farmer an ease of mind on the technology front of there's automatic wind machines that they'll turn on once it hits a certain temperature. There's the automatic valves that you can turn on from your phone and you can get those sprinklers running. There's guys that used to put propane lines in their fields, and so that you'd have basically a constant source of heat coming out of the ground. They also use smudge pots, which is using diesel fuel that basically will burn hot, and all of that I think you can automate. The problem is one, the cost to get it there and the ease of mind of the farmer. That's really the ease of mind that it's a foolproof 100% non-failure system, because something you have to consider is that, like an example would be with the automatic wind machines, is those are great, but if you don't have something that's telling you what the wind's doing outside of that wind machine, you can run into a big issue if that wind machine's going, but yet it's also blowing wind, because basically that wind machine can start getting unstable. And that can do more damage, and so you need to go run and turn that wind machine off.
Back up for a second. I want to hear more about that. The wind machine becomes unstable, or what's going on in this? Because
yes, so there's past stories where guys had wind machines on, they were blowing, but yet the winds were gusting. And so you've got that big blade, going up, and then that wind's gusting, and there's some other issues going on here, but that blade could actually come off. Those are very rare, and they can, yeah, that's very, very rare. That doesn't happen often. But there's no point of having that wind machine on when you've got wind going, and when there's already a wind event going. And so in those cases, it's like, we're going to send a guy out there to make sure that they turn that wind machine off, because you're just either burning diesel, and there's no reason to have that wind machine on. You've got sprinklers and valves. Automated valves are great, and now they've got the ones where they've got these pressure systems that are telling you, hey, you may have a blockage or a leak because we've seen a decrease in your pressure. So we're going to send a guy out, and he's going to look at those valves. Well, we're always going to send the guy out looking at where that water's hitting, for that sheer fact of knowing that all those valves are clean and open. And so it's almost like and then there's a peace of mind where that farmer, that owner, grower, he just wants to see that wind machine's on. He wants to visually see that it's on. And he also wants to visually see those sprinklers on. And so if you had a foolproof system with alerts, even like a camera showing things on, showing what the weather's doing all around you, and even I don't know, even 100% confirm to the farmer that there will be frost protection and there's no chance of failure, I think there could be some success, but it's a very big task because there's a lot of factors that have to be measured
No
for
doubt.
that to really gain that faith.
I mean, we sort of get this technologically, which is, we've got this monitoring system, and then we need a monitoring system to monitor the monitoring system, in the form
Yep.
of logs and all that type of stuff. And then, those logs are themselves somewhat, voluminous. So you need a monitoring system to monitor the monitoring system. And so it becomes like, wow, that it's a lot. But if you could just like go out there and see if the fan's on, the human
Right.
brain is a lot more capable of detecting the nuance of things that are going right or not than it would be possible, to instrument. I mean, what you're talking about, the dynamics of the wind in the valley is like, that's some complicated stuff.
Yeah. I mean, these crops are thousands and thousands. I mean, really, I mean, some can be $1 million crops, and so you, yeah, if you're at say 80% open bloom and you've been at say you're at 30 degrees or you're at 27 degrees for more than 15 minutes. I mean, you could have 80% damage to all your pistils, and all those pistils are on your bloomer. You just killed all your blooms.
Sure.
So, I mean, it could just take 15 minutes and it can wipe it out. So that's why they just are like, oh, we'll just send someone out there. And as much as they love seeing what tech can bring, there really has to be that buy-in that you're going to promise me that this is on and this is happening, and I have 110% confidence that this is being executed.
I tend to think that that is an impossible promise to make, but the reality is there's only so many people who are going into agriculture each year, and that number is less and less. Um, and we need to prioritize people's attention in terms of where or when. And so I think some of the technological opportunities are helping triage these events, that what you're describing is like there's a lot of territory to cover, and how to
Yep.
keep tabs on it. It's almost like these firefighters that are out in the backwoods. It's complicated, it's widespread, you only got a handful of guys. You need intel on how the whole situation is unfolding in order to master it.
I definitely would agree. And even the tools to help that, it gives the owner peace of mind, because he may still send a guy out, but if he's got something in his hand that tells him what's going on, I mean, that gives him a peace of mind as well.
Yeah. And I mean, to know that everybody is awake and doing their thing, I mean, that's another part of uh, preparedness, let's call it, is knowing that
Yep.
everybody answered the buzzer. And one of the areas that you've really pressed us on is fallbacks on announcements. Like, okay, well, it's one thing to have an email, but what about a text message? What about a fallback to a voice message? What about, like, if that guy doesn't answer, then call his boss?
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
um,
Yeah. Because. Yep.
I guess it gets back to like monitoring systems of the monitoring systems. It's like having there be intelligent fallbacks. um, let's fall back ourselves onto questions. Hey, look at that, no questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess in case any questions trickle in, I just wanted to understand the economics of it. Like, how much do you spend each year? on frost prevention? Like maybe, I don't know if you can think of it as per acre or as a fraction of your total budget. Is this taking up 1%, 10%?
That's a hard one to answer. I mean, on average, I would say like this year on areas that we're not really worried about frost. We still see probably about 5 or 10% of frost damage on those blooms.
Mm-hmm.
But see, a lot of what this comes down to though is especially like in apples, and I know for other crops it might not be this way, but apples you kind of have a little bit of insurance in the sense of how did you prune that tree? Because guys that are leaving very long, like for Gala's example, very long branches, they may have a lot of blooms that year on those branches, but there's also a thing called a lot of light management to get those. So you cut that branch really short, so you're not wasting your real estate space on that branch. And so what I'm getting at is that it all depends on your crop load management on the number of blossoms. I mean, that's where that number is really going to come into play, because if I've got X number of blossoms and frost only took out 5 or 10% of that, I'm also going to kind of put that into my variable on my chemical thinning analysis. And so you're looking at I just feel like I'm throwing a dart if I put a number on an exact number.
No,
on
but
that.
I loved how you approached how you would approach estimating it, and we'll leave it as an exercise for the viewers to do the math.
Yeah.
Hey, we've got a couple questions, and I have to say that on these things that are coming up, you're kind of the expert. When is the last time you saw someone use a smudge pot?
This year,
This
April,
year?
we were still using them. Yeah, we still use them heavily throughout the orchards. We'll do smudge pots and then also just put a wood fire down on the ground in the roads.
Yeah. All right. There you have your answer. Widespread and heavy usage. All right. Greg is asking, without spending a small fortune, is there a quick fix to a cold spring morning inflicting damage on my tender grapevine shoots? So mid-spring, they had a cold night, 22 degrees. Holy cow, that's cold. And they lost a couple rows, 58 vines died to the roots down at the base of a hill. So what's your advice?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of experience with grapevines, but
Well, picture they were
if
pears or
they're
something sensitive.
yeah, if they're down at the bottom of a hill, I mean, depends on how big of an orchard, how big of a vineyard you have here, but that's when I would be looking into a small fan on that bottom hill, and along with putting those smudge pots or a fire down there, and that would help prevent the damage.
How far ahead of
I've
time
also
do you
seen
have to start the fire?
they're starting fires at like 3 or 4 in the morning to get those hot embers going. Because the coldest part typically is right when that sun rises. That is your coldest point. Typically, there are some nights that can get really cold, but for the most part, it's right when that sun rises and that warm air starts transitioning.
So you got, let's call it a smallish fire, and then how modest of a fan can you get away with? No fan, and it'll just kind of warm up that area, that pool at the bottom of the hill?
Yeah, without seeing it, yes. I mean, you can maybe try that, and just hope that there's a breeze. I've also seen guys with grapevines. They if it's smaller, they can do that, the whole drop cloth on them.
Oh, sure.
And
Yeah.
just protect them that old school way. But 22 degrees is pretty cold, so I think you may. It depends also too if they're waking up.
I mean, I just got my cloth from Johnny's, arrived last week in time for some frost because we're busy planting our perishables. So a question from an almond grower. Have you ever seen in the varieties you work with reblooming after a severe frost?
Oh, like alternate well, yes. There we have seen I've seen late bloom that happens out in the summertime, and that's something that you don't want. It's going to happen regardless in apples. You're going to have a little bit of late bloom where that tree's a little confused. But the worst thing that we have that in tree fruit is alternate bearing, and there's certain varieties that can, if you don't do your crop load management well enough and looking at your blossoms, you can get into a scenario where you're doing alternate bearing, which means it's going to skip a year on bloom. So one year it's going to have a ton of blooms, the next year it won't have hardly any blooms.
So would a frost sort of kick in, and let's say you've been diligent about trying to prevent alternate bearing, could a frost kick you out of that cycle where suddenly you lost a bunch of blossoms and then next year it's going to be too heavy and kind of amplify the alternate bearing?
Yes, I mean it could. There's a point in apple trees at that point with the blossom, if it hasn't been pollinized yet, it could wipe out. But then I don't think I've ever seen, and I would actually have to ask some of the guys here, but I have never seen where once the frost wipes out, like a week or 2 weeks later or a month later, you then see blooms appearing again. Like on a significant scale where it's commercially viable. You may see it here and there, yes, but you wouldn't see it where it would save you.
Got it. And here we've got a question. This seems to be oriented more on cherries. I think higher value crop. Any experience with plastic roofs to prevent frost control? I guess it's a variation on some sort of covering.
Yeah, so that's a great question. There are a lot of guys for cherries will put covering over their cherries. They do it mostly for hail damage and to actually keep the cherries dry so the cherries don't crack. It's rare. I've never seen them open those coverings during a frost event. But I do know there's guys in Michigan that have been testing that in the sense of if I start the cherry tree sooner and they kind of do this semi-quasi kind of greenhouse event, that does help with with protecting those cherries, and they are warmer under that environment.
I bet. And you said to prevent cracking, is it a rain out so that it diverts the rain so they don't burst like after a heavy?
So cherries in that stem, you get a Bing cherry, a red cherry from the grocery store, and you look at that, there's that stem on the top of that cherry with a little bit of a bowl. That if that water sits in there too long, you'll get cherries cracking or splitting. And at that point you can't sell those cherries. And so they'll do a cover to help prevent that water from sitting on those cherries, or they'll even go as far as they'll hire a helicopter, and he'll fly a helicopter above that orchard to dry all the cherries off.
Got it. One last question. Do you ever have snow have impacts like frost, or is that a little bit closer to a sprinkler and preventing frost?
Yeah, so snow could actually be a whole nother topic. Snow can be your friend, but it also can be your enemy. Snow can be an insulating factor, but another factor of it too, though, is if you have a really warm day and you've got a field cover of snow, well, that sunlight's hitting it, it's reflecting up, and what you're getting is you're warming that tree up, and that tree starts thinking, oh, I should start waking up. And so then your blooms start pushing, and that starts waking up. Well, you still may be in a cold event where you've got those cold nights if that snow's still on that ground. And so it can help if you're consistently cold, it can help. But if you get in those fluctuations where it's getting warmer and then it's dropping back down and freezing, getting warmer, that's where you can start to run into issues with that tree waking up because of that snow reflecting off. So there's ways you can prevent that by putting like a sun shield up under that base by that root zone. But that all comes down to the labor costs too, and trying to play that game.
Okay, final question. Did you give any thought to what a future topic for farming fast and slow might be?
Yeah, I would say I would love to have a topic more on just software companies and tech companies and ag tech and their approaches and their different approaches on how they're solving solutions. And then not just actually having a solution, but the practicality of it from the grower's standpoint and how they're actually using it. Not conceptually, but really how are they using it when they're in their truck, when they're walking in the field? And how is that helping them get their job done, making them better informed decisions? I'd say that'd be a great topic to go over.
Love it. And if anybody else online listening has a topic that you want us to cover, let us know. And we're excited to dive in. All right. So thank you very much, and see you next week.
Thank you.